Beijing's media managers have spent time in recent days expressing displeasure. Perhaps not surprisingly, they came up with a quick riposte to the noises coming from Congress on the currency issue and on US arms sales to Taiwan. But Vietnam is out of favour for forming closer defence ties with India, and Hanoi's Communist Party chief will next week visit Beijing. In fact, China's expressions of displeasure have concerned a long list of countries in the Asia-Pacific region, and some have turned to the United States. But these countries are also worried about US capacity and willingness to guarantee their security. So, with two key Asia summits on the agenda next month, where do things stand? Welcome to Agenda with Rodger Baker. Rodger, do these countries, many living under the shadow of China and very dependent on it for business, are they right to be concerned about the US?
When we look at the Asia-Pacific region, there's been a perception that for the past 10, 15, maybe even longer years, that the United States has not been involved. The United States basically walked away from Asia. At the end of the Asian economic crisis, it was seen that the U.S. maybe didn't re-engage in the region very quickly. And then by 2001, obviously, the U.S. is distracted and pulled into the Middle East very heavily. Even under the second Bush administration and under Obama, there's been an interest exhibited by the United States to move back into East Asia to expand its political, economic, and security relationships, but there hasn't been necessarily the bandwidth or the attention paid. We have seen a lot of moves by the U.S. during this time period, and some of them don't seem quite as obvious. The re-engagement with Myanmar, for example, and some modifications of relations with Cambodia and Laos, which really paved the way for the U.S. to solidify its relationship with ASEAN, which was something that was important for Indonesia, for the U.S. building that relationship. And now we see the U.S. pulling into this East Asia Summit, something that when it started up, the U.S. really had reservations about and maybe even tried to play down or not encourage it. So we see some re-engagement by the United States. There is a longer-term interest for the U.S. to come back, but certainly as China's growth has moved so rapidly and as China really is trying to understand how to utilize its greater power, we're seeing more nervousness from a lot of the peripheral countries.
Many Asian countries were heartened by Secretary Clinton's early statements about America's return to Asia, but fear now the U.S. may be backtracking.
I think the concern in some sense is that they're seeing a much more immediate issue from the Chinese. The United States sees this as a long-term strategic interest of the U.S. If you look at global trade, trans-Pacific trade is particularly important now, maybe even higher than transatlantic trade, particularly if you don't count intra-European trade. And so the United States obviously sees Asia as a place, it's one of the few places in the world that has continuously growing economies. It's a place where trade is much greater. It's in the U.S. economic interest to re-engage. This is part of what spurs the U.S. to push the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which will probably be discussed again or at least mentioned again at APEC and the East Asia Summit coming up. But certainly the U.S. isn't rushing back into the region in a very obvious way. It's perhaps a little more subtle, a little more measured, a little lower level than perhaps some of these Asian countries would want. But the U.S. still has very strong interest in resolving the issues in the Middle East to allow U.S. troops to come out. And the U.S. wants to balance carefully with how it deals with China. This isn't a Cold War scenario. There's not an interest in completely encircling the Chinese and trying to seal them off. There's more an interest in trying to manage the expansion and interaction of the Chinese within the region. And so we see Washington at times taking a more cautious approach or a more measured approach that for a country like, say, the Philippines, that for internal political reasons and for economic reasons wants to push the issue much faster, the U.S. doesn't seem to be moving at the pace they would like.
They worry, of course, when China speaks with a harsher voice. There was that editorial in the People's Daily which said, quotes, "Certain countries think as long as they can balance China with the help of US military power, they're free to do whatever they want," unquote.
The Chinese are feeling very constrained right now. Domestically, they're facing an economic situation that is much worse than they've had in the past. Their big fear is that some foreign power, namely the United States, takes advantage of this moment and tries to crack Chinese strength. They see the U.S. engagement in the region as an attempt to constrain or encircle China. So where the U.S. is dealing with Myanmar more from the issue of managing ASEAN relationships, the Chinese see that as the U.S. trying to cut off a potential strategic supply line for the Chinese, cut off Chinese access to alternate routes for natural gas and oil. The U.S. engagement with Vietnam from the Chinese perspective is giving Vietnam the sense of strength to stand up and start pushing back against China in territorial issues. Issues with the Philippines. Around the region, China perceives U.S. engagement as something that is aggressive, that is encirclement, and that is very clearly, from the Chinese perspective, a mirror of U.S. Soviet policy. The Chinese, in dealing with their neighbors then, run this almost contradictory line of reasoning. On the one hand, they lay out, look, working with China is great. It helps all of your economies. We're not really threatening. And then they lay parallel to that, but if you want to act threatening and think that the U.S. is going to come and bail you out and that will allow you to be threatening to us, think again, because in the end we will protect our strategic interests. And they want to, into that, place an element of doubt in the Southeast Asian countries as to whether or not the U.S. really will come in and bail them out. And we saw, for example, the South Korean case, when the U.S. didn't send an aircraft carrier into the Yellow Sea because of Chinese complaints. That rippled not only within the South Korean community, but in the Southeast Asian community, where those countries were looking and saying, well, but if China makes comments, the U.S. might not back us up. And this is where we lead towards this issue of Vietnam, because in the case of Vietnam, we see the tensions rising. We see some hints coming out of the Chinese that they may even be willing to allow some sort of maritime skirmish in some of these disputed waters, and they're betting that the U.S. would not be intervening in a Vietnamese case, whereas, for example, in the Philippines, the U.S. would be treaty-bound to intervene, and that would further undermine the perception in the region of U.S. reliability.
Is that a safe bet for Beijing to be making?
Well, it's not necessarily a safe bet to try to encourage even a minor skirmish with the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese have a very strong interest and are fairly capable of pushing back against the Chinese with or without the United States. Also, if the Chinese play their hand too aggressively, what we see in response is the Southeast Asian nations pulling closer together. We see the Indians coming in and taking advantage of that sense of concern by the Southeast Asians. We see the Japanese starting to re-engage in defense cooperation, in political and economic cooperation. And so this is a very delicate game for the Chinese. They want to showcase that the U.S. is an unreliable partner when it comes to risking confrontation with China, but at the same time, they don't want to act so aggressively that all of Southeast Asia pulls together in a bloc against China.
And while this has been going on, it's become fashionable for academics from Tokyo to Canberra and throughout the region to churn out papers headed China versus the US, implying political leaders will have soon to make a choice.
What we're seeing in these countries is that they're trying to raise this issue. It's not really that they're looking to go bipolar one way or the other. They're not really looking to say, well, we have to go with the US and leave China aside, or we have to go with China and leave the US aside. Instead, they're trying to find a way to balance and manage between the two. And for the longest time, there was a much stronger leaning towards China, taking advantage of China's economic growth, the sense that China, while it was growing very fast, it wasn't necessarily threatening, or that there wasn't a really strong alternative to dealing with China. Japan was really out of the picture economically, regionally. The United States was preoccupied elsewhere. What we see in these academic papers then is, okay, let's raise the issue. Let's make it a big issue. Let's maybe exploit even further this perceived competition between the U.S. and the Chinese, that we can in fact make it real competition between the U.S. and Chinese. And as a country in the middle, we can take advantage of that and gain more from both Washington and China, and maybe play down the threat of either of those countries to our own particular security situation.
So you don't think the outcome of all this discussion could be a choice?
I think that in many ways the countries recognize that there's not really a way to choose one or the other, because it's not just about the question of security. It's about the question of economics. It's about the question of of trade. The Chinese are in the region. There's really no way for any of the countries on the periphery of China to not remain engaged economically, politically, socially, even in some sense from a security perspective with the Chinese. At the same time, because China is their neighbor, they really need something to balance that out so that the Chinese influence and the Chinese power does not grow too strong and leave them with limited options.
Rodger, we'll leave it there for now. Rodger Baker, ending this week's agenda. Thanks very much for being with us.